Hello, and thanks for joining me for week 14 of the Summer Square series. I have been going through beads this week, and I thought it might be fun to show you a few beaded embellishments that we can use to add interest and sparkle to the quilts that we make. I went through some fabrics to find motifs I could add these little beaded bead clusters onto, and I found these three to consider. I am using the same color size 12 seed bead, which are the little tiny ones for each flower, just for some consistency. And then I chose 4mm crystals that I had at least 6 of the same color. I'll also be using some 4mm round beads and size 6 seed beads, which you can find just about anywhere. The crystals are really nice to use because as the light hits them, they're really sparkly. But if you don't have them, just play with what you have, making sure that your bigger beads are no larger than a size 6 seed bead. If you do have even larger beads, you can still make these work, but use something a little bit bigger for your netting, where I'm using the size 12. Maybe try a size 8 seed bead instead of a 12. But, you just have to play around and see what works. They're really easy to do and just as easy to undo. I really like the big silhouette flowers of this fabric, and I have little crystals that might go nicely, so I'm going to work on this one. I'm using a tiny needle and Nemo beading thread, but a poly sewing thread works well too. When you're stringing your beads on, don't tie a knot at the end just yet. To start the frame, we're just stringing on one crystal or larger bead and then a tiny size 12 seed bead until you have 9 of each. Leave the threaded beads on your work surface so they don't slide off. When you have all 18 of your beads on, 9 each, tie a double knot encasing the beads within the circle. If you're using the bead thread or something really slippery like that, don't snug the first knot all the way down until you have your double knot worked, as this thread is pretty slippery, and these little guys have a way of working themselves into the knot. So I've learned to just tie the knot, leave a little space, tie the other knot, and then pull it and slide it all together so that knot snugs into the bead ring. This might take you a couple tries. It still sometimes takes me a couple tries. But pull it tight and then take your needle and pass it through all of the beads again. Take your time here and go slow to make sure you pass through every single bead, or your circle will be skewed. When you get back around, make sure you're exiting out of a tiny seed bead. Now we're going to build a net. So you place 12 seed beads on the needle, so in other words, the tiny ones. Skip over the crystal or bigger bead that you're using, and then pass the needle through the next tiny bead in the circle. So you're going to work that way all the way around until all of the larger beads you've chosen have a net above them, a 5-bead net. And then to close it, make sure you enter the last tiny bead of the previous round. Then go through all of them again. This strengthens the wheel and allows just for a more secure bead as you stitch, so it's worth taking the extra time to just go through them again and secure it. But be really careful here and make sure that your needle is going through every tiny bead, including the ones that you strung on initially. In other words, the tiny beads between the crystals, because those are our little anchors. When you get back to the beginning, exit the needle out the top of the peak of the net, which would be the third of the 5 beads you strung on previously. Then you're going to string on one tiny, one crystal or larger bead, and one tiny. Pass it through the next third bead peak on the next net to fill that space with the new beads. I am using a different color crystal here, but you could use the same or even a different shape altogether. You just have to play and experiment here. If you have a pile of beads that you have no idea what size they are, still try this. You have no way of knowing what it's going to look like until you get them strung on. So just play and have fun. If you hate it, just cut it all apart and start with something different. I have done that lots before in my experimenting. Now, if you're familiar with beading, you might know what delicas are. They are size 12 seed beads, but they're cut in a cylindrical tube shape, and they are really effective here. So if you have delicas, you could use those too. But for this, I just went with a basic size 12 bead, as I just wanted to stay with beads that are accessible at the big box stores in case you don't have a bead shop near you. All these beads I'm using can be found at Joann's or Michael's, and they always have sales on their beads. So it's not a super expensive endeavor if you need to go buy beads. And if you've shopped my Etsy for kits, you might even have some leftover beads from those. And the new bead kits I have on there definitely have a few different colors of size 12, 8, and 6, and they all sort of go together. I've got some bugles and some other random beads in those kits. But I am not sure that there's enough crystals, but the kits are really great. If you're needing some of these smaller seed beads and lots of them, you can find those through my Etsy shop at Myhre Designs. Once you reach the beginning, make sure you go through the beads strung previously before you go through the new ones that you just strung. Lots of people overlook this step, but this will anchor it down and make sure your beaded bead stays round. And then, yep, you guessed it, go through them all again, making sure you go through the anchor bead at the top of the net again each time. So our goal is not to see the thread here, and to strengthen the bead. So make sure you're going through that third one of the net in between the new beads strung on just this round. And when you're finished, just weave both ends up through the beads, kind of zigzagging to hide the thread and then further secure the bead. And then clip it, and you have a sparkly ring that you can sew onto your block. Now, this is the basic foundation for a beaded bead that you can start with to make all kinds of different shapes and use all different kinds of beads up. It's really fun. And it's not too time consuming, and it adds so much sparkle to your fabrics. So let's make some more. So the setup is the same for this one, but I'm using a different color thread and 4mm round beads, still with those same copper size 12 seed. I want to make a smaller one for the smaller flower in the background, so I'm stringing on 6 of each. So once you have all 12 of your beads on, tie your knot as before. Run through all the beads again, and then exit out the tiny seed bead to get ready to make your net. The bead is relatively the same size as the crystal, so I'll be stringing on 5 tiny seed beads as before for my net and anchoring them down by passing the needle through each tiny bead, skipping over the large bead. When you get to the last, pass through the last tiny bead left in the original ring, and then pass the needle through all the new netting beads along with that tiny anchor seed bead in the original ring. As before, exit the needle out of the top third bead of the net. Looks like there's a little bit more space. The 4mm rounds are a little wider, so I'm going to experiment here and just string on 2 seed beads, a crystal, and 2 seed beads. And then I'm going to still pass it through the top bead of the next net. Now, it's okay if your beaded beads cup up a little. This will actually add dimension and further sparkle. These aren't always meant to lie perfectly flat. So if yours is cupping up, that's okay. That's good. It's kind of nice too because there's more room for experimentation. If you were trying to keep your beads really flat, you'd be doing a lot more trial and error. But for here, it's nice because they just cup up however they want to. Just let them. As long as you're happy with what it looks like, you can just keep going. Once you get all your new beads added, anchor it down, and then you know what comes next. Pass through all the beads again, including your anchor bead from the previous round. And now we're going to make a net to lay on top for a double decker. So when you get back to the beginning, exit the needle out between the two small beads to the right of the crystal. String on 5 tiny seed beads. Allow the net to fold down over the piece and pass the needle between the beads to the left of the crystal so that your needle is exiting out of the little space between the seed beads. String on 1 tiny seed bead to fill that space and pass it through the next seed bead so that once again you're exiting out between the two beads to the right of the crystal. And you're just going to repeat this pattern around. When you get back to the beginning, pass through them all again and exit out the third bead of the new net. Now we're going to do another pass, which will lie right on top of the bead. So you're going to string a tiny seed bead, a crystal, or 4mm of whatever, and a tiny seed bead and pass through the third bead of the next net. Work that all the way around. Pass through all the beads once again, and then once you're done and you feel like your bead is really secure, you can zigzag weave both ends through to the back and just kind of weave them in and out of the beads. It doesn't really matter here. And then you can just lay it on your fabric and see what it looks like. And this block is getting blingy. I love it. Okay, let's try one with size 6 seed beads. I've started the initial ring and net just like before, as exactly as we did the first one. I didn't have pink crystals, and so I wanted to reference pink in the fabric, so I found these guys. So I strung on 9 of each and then made my little net. So at the top of the net, as I'm passing through the third one, I'm using 1 tiny seed, 1 crystal, 1 tiny seed, and passing it through the third bead of each net to fill the little spaces. And once you're done, of course, you want to go through them all again just to solidify the piece. And I think I'll stop this one here. I really like it. And notice, even though it was the exact same pattern as the first one, they look quite a bit different just because of the slight difference in original bead shape. So the first one I did crystals, and the second one I did size 6 seed beads, but I did exactly the same pattern, the same thing. So it's kind of interesting too. Your beads will completely dictate what this thing looks like. Okay, so let's do a smaller one for the smaller motifs. So this time I used crystals and the same size 12 seed beads, and I strung on 7 of each. Went through them all again, and I exited out a tiny seed bead. So this is the same exact beginning pattern as before, strung 5, skip the crystal, and pass through the next tiny. And why not just stop it right here? Like, I love the different shape. It's just enough sparkle for this little flower. And it's just fun to play with the different ones. This block's going to be super sparkly, so we don't need to do huge bead centers for these. We can do some big, some small, and that's just going to add a lot of interest to your piece. So next up, I'm going to do the size 6 pink seed beads as before. This time I strung on 8 and I exited out the tiny. But I want to play with something a little bit different here. I want to see what it's going to look like if I make spokes. So once you're exiting out the tiny bead, string on 5 tiny seed beads. I had 1 elongated crystal and 1 more tiny. So the last tiny is going to serve as our stopper. So when you go back through the beads, you're going to skip that one. That'll keep our spoke in place. So skip that tiny, go back down through the crystal and 3 of the seed beads just below it. Be careful here and try not to split your thread. Pull the string so the spoke is against the piece and then add 2 more beads before passing it through the next tiny seed bead from the original ring. So we're adding a spoke that will go over each size 6 bead here. So let's do another one. Once you have all 8 spokes, go through them all again and weave in your tails. I really love this one. Incidentally, this would make an amazing center to start a mandala. I'm just saying. Okay, let's do one more for the last whole flower here, and then we can stitch them on and then maybe play with some additional beading on the fabric in the background. So I just started with a basic ring pattern. I love this color of crystal, but I only have 6 of them, so this will be another small one, which is totally fine. So rather than do a net this time, I want to try beading them in between the crystals. Let's try that. So once you've passed the needle all the way around your ring, rather than exit out a crystal or a larger bead, whatever bead you used. Now this time I found these little mustard color, smaller crystals. They're a little bit elongated, but I think they go really well with the fabric, so I'm just going to try them. So this time I'm going to add 1 tiny, 1 crystal, 1 tiny, and pass it through the next crystal. And this one is definitely easier on the eyes. But notice how the smaller beads that you just added nestle in with the original bead from the previous round to form a little triangle. And that was a nice surprise. I wasn't planning on that. I'm just playing here. So once you're done with the round, then of course pass it through all the beads again to solidify the piece and just make it easier to stitch on them. Your beads aren't sliding all over the place. It's just worth it. I know I hate doing all that extra stuff, but I'll only do it if it's necessary. And here I just think you'll be happier with the solid piece. And I really like the way this one looks. So I'm just going to stop here. Now, of course, you could spend the day playing around and experimenting with different nets, different colors, different beads, different shapes, making spokes. Make these as big as you want to. Come up with something new. I'd love to see where your creativity takes you. Okay, and then as far as stitching these guys on, it's super easy. What I did is I just took a photo of where I wanted each bead so that I could remember and not even really have to think about it. I'll just start with this little one. I've got the same beading thread that I used, but of course any sewing thread here will work. Poly is really great. It resembles beading thread. And just starting with one of the pieces, and of course I've got the batting on the background that I love to do, is you can kind of come up anywhere through the back and onto the piece, because this thread, what's so great is it'll sink down behind the beads, so you really won't ever see it. So I'm just starting at a place. And here I don't even go through the beads. I just go kind of over the beads in between them so that the thread does sink down and holds the threads that I originally used in the beading. So just take it really slow here because of course with all the beads, you're going to get caught up on stuff. And then just manipulate it so it's centered. And so what I'll do is I'll go through kind of maybe under each little spoke here, and then I'll go back in and maybe just do it a little bit more detailed inside the piece. But at least this just bastes it down, it holds it down for a minute while I'm stitching the rest of it on. I'm not going to do too much more designing on this because this is really just a reference for me personally on all the different little beading things that I could do. So this is going to live in my journal to refer to when I do want to add a little bit of bling to some of my quilts. So I'm going to go ahead and work on stitching these beads on just like this. Nothing really fancy or tricky or proper here, you know, you're just beading them on. And then like this one got a little skewed, so if you need to, you could sew the bead up through the fabric, through the bead, and back down to the fabric and really get it on there securely. It's however you want to do it and how secure. It definitely depends on what you're going to use this piece for. If it's a wall hanging or a block in your journal, you know, you can just stitch them on there really quick and have a nice reference, but you do want them on there securely. And I think what I'll do is for the rest of the piece is I'm not going to do any embroidery. Like I said, this is really specifically just to keep track of the bead wheels. I think what I'll do in the background of the piece is just do almost like a seed stitch, but with just a bead. So I'm just going to put little beads like confetti scattered evenly around the block, just for some extra shine. And with the batting, it's going to look quilted. It's going to look kind of cool, kind of like a tied quilt. So I don't know. I probably won't even go through them twice, honestly. And then as far as thread color, with beading, it's opposite as applique. Where applique, you really want to match your thread to the applique, but in beading, you want to match the thread as close as you can to the background, because you can kind of see the thread. So I could even use like a dark blue here. I happen to have blue beading thread, so I'm just using that. And it will look more like a shadow than an actual thread piece. All right, so I'm going to work on stitching these and the background, and I will come back and show you what it looks like when it's done. And here it is, all finished and quilted and beaded. And I think this is going to be a welcome addition to the journal, and just a great reference. You know, a lot of times I think if it's been a certain amount of time before I do this again, I think, okay, where are those beads? How did I do that? So it's going to be really nice to just go back and reference these. So I also want to show you some pictures that have come through from previous blocks. You guys, thank you so much for sending in your photos and following along. This is amazing. So this is Sarah's Curvy Improv. Love this block. I love the colors, how she took really similar colors but different prints and put them together. It's awesome. And then if you put them together as a quad, this is what that would look like. And then Myhre had done a curved piece, and she did the mirror image where she did the reverse templates, and this one is so sweet and so cute. I told her it reminded me of like pink bubbles, blowing bubbles. It's just awesome. And then this is what it would look like if you put 4 of hers together. Love it. Such a happy blog. And then Trish is at a retreat with some fellow stitchers in Idaho. She had used scraps from the other people that she's retreating with and came up with this amazing block. And it's awesome. It kind of reminds me of like tropical seed pod or something. I don't know. And then we put the 4 together, and I'm getting like this Chinese lantern. So super, super cool colors that weren't completely improv, as she was using the scraps from her fellow retreaters. It's really incredible, amazing. And then Debbie is working hard. She has got this beaded embroidery block that she had done, and I mean, this just looks like the most amazing emerald forest that I would absolutely love to skip through. It's beautiful. Good job. And then she also showed me a picture of her English paper piecing with her little bird and flower theme that she's got for her journal. And this is just perfection. It's so, so beautiful. So well done, you guys. Again, thank you so much. I love, love, love seeing your photos. So next week, I think I want to play with some reverse applique with wool, doing some wool applique, maybe a little bit of embroidery for our 15th block. So we will see you then. Until then, have a wonderful week. Happy stitching, and thanks again so much for following along. Take care.